This is Dr. Pulley for Com 101 at Heartland Community College, dual credit or early college edition, chapter 3 lecture on ethics in public speaking. Okay, so our objectives for this chapter are to define what ethics is, define defamatory speech, initial credibility versus derived credibility versus terminal credibility, and finally look at what plagiarism is. Explain also the legal, cultural, philosophical, and social origins of ethics in public speaking. We'll explain the difference between plagiarism and correct appropriation of source materials and how to cite them so that we are doing correct appropriation, and understand the value of ethics in building a solid reputation as a speaker and correctly using source materials in a presentation. It's a bit different than from a paper. So the preview here from the chapter 3 sections are section 1, sources of ethics in communication, which are legal, cultural, and philosophical, as we mentioned just a second ago. Section 2 deals with credibility and ethics, and section 3 deals with using sources and avoiding plagiarism. So ethics is the branch of philosophy that involves determinations of what is right and what is wrong. So this is part of like a morality kind of thing. So is this right? Is this wrong? And the ideas of this being correct versus incorrect as well, true versus false. There is a core concern for public speaking because of individual, community, and democratic even outcomes. Okay, so the legal background here is things like the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, which includes the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or the press. However, there have been several Supreme Court decisions that have addressed various situations, such as obscenity. We used to have the vague thing, I know it when I see it, censorship, flag burning, and types of things, and even things like hate speech. Freedom of speech leads to a broader freedom of expression, but again, not all speech is protected. They generally interpret it very broadly, but again, not everything is freely protected. Okay, such as threats to the life of the president. Communities can set reasonable requirements for public safety in terms of something that might cause a concern. You can't just have a gathering sometimes without having a permit signed up for because there might be a safety issue. You can't also yell fire in a crowded theater unless there is a fire and you're trying to get people out. But if you yell that and people get injured on the way out and there's no fire, that wouldn't be protected. Cases where speech could likely incite violence, including hate speech, as I mentioned earlier, defamation, which is slander and libel. Slander being I say it, libel being I wrote it and had it published. By the way, if you record something and publish that out, that would count as libel versus slander. And defamatory speech, which is a false statement of a fact. So what I'm trying to say is a false fact that damages a person's character, fame, or reputation. Then there are cultural and religious sources for our ideas of ethics. In terms of religious, the idea of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Every single basic religious text of all the major religions has a variation of the golden rule as part of it. Culturally, community standards, as we mentioned earlier, but also morality laws in terms of what can be done and can't be done are things that address this. But there are also, sort of standards within a country or society or tradition that are influenced, that make up cultural things. And then, of course, our family upbringing. Some people may have a different family upbringing than someone else and have different sets of values of what is and isn't appropriate. Going back to other sources, just going way back to the ancient Greeks and our Plato in this case. By the way, that would be Socrates. His student was Plato. Plato's student was Aristotle. Aristotle's student, by the way, was Alexander the Great. He noticed the power of speakers to mislead an audience. And this is a group he's talking about called the Sophists, which is a whole other story. Quintilian, this is during the Roman Empire, said rhetoric is the good man speaking well. That I'm not just speaking, but I'm speaking well, not just in terms of my delivery, but also being ethically sourced as well. Utilitarianism is this idea that for people, this is a social idea, that it's what is the greatest good for the greatest number. If you're a Star Trek fan, that would be sort of a Spock thing. The good of the many outweighs the good of the few or the one. Ideas behind utilitarianism are John Stuart Mill. There's pragmatism, which consequences are the judge. What comes out of this is, well, let it go, and then we'll see what the consequences are and make the decision from there and judge it based on the consequences or outcomes. Charles Sanders Peirce was the person behind that sort of championing that pragmatism sort of idea. Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher with the idea of the categorical imperative, which is act towards a universal law without saying that universal law is pretty much essentially the golden rule. And existentialism is the individual choice, but also individual responsibility to hopefully make the correct choice. And Habermas, equal opportunity to fully participate, but again, equal opportunity for all, but again, you should be making the proper decisions and moral decisions. Unfortunately, no, that's not always the case in the world today. Okay, section 2, credibility and ethics, ethos and credibility. Ethos is, as Aristotle said, wisdom, sagacity, and the character of the speaker. And today it's the attitude of the audience towards the speaker based on reality and perception. And that's an important thing to know. Sources are your main place to get credibility. As non-experts in whatever your topic is going to be, for the most part, you need to find sources that are expert sources on that, and then you are borrowing that credibility. Okay. Also want to know about the idea of similarity, how similar you are, but you can relate your topic to your audience. Your character, your honesty, your integrity, that you've done your research, that you're citing that research correctly. Competence is expertise in a topic. And again, you may have some expertise. For example, if you were doing one on basketball and you played in different little leagues or different leagues when you were younger, park rec leagues, and then are on the basketball team in junior high and high school, you've got some expertise, but you're not an expert per se because you haven't written and published on it. And goodwill is that you have good intentions to the audience, that you're trying to give them good and accurate information. Other things that make us in terms of liking this is likability of the person, their poise, their confidence, their appearance, their humor. And I got poise in there twice for some reason. Must be important. Okay. Credibility varies. It differs from audience to audience. It differs even within a speech. At some point, you may kind of think, hey, things aren't going well. Then it kind of smooths out and gets better. Or it may start off really well and kind of go downhill. There are some things called the halo and horns effect that if you, for example, do a couple of good citations early on, that gives you this sense of credibility and a halo effect that even if your other ones aren't as well cited later, the audience seems to think you're doing a good job because you did the first few correctly. Alternatively, if you make a few mistakes, even if you do them correctly later on, they may, that horns effect that you've sort of done things incorrectly, even though you're doing them correctly later on. Okay. There's also credibility called initial credibility when you first start, how you get up there. That's how you look, what the audience knows about you or doesn't know about you. There is derived, which is during the speech, and then terminal at the end. So let's break those three down into more details. Initial, credibility at the beginning or even before the speech. Have you heard of this person? Have you read their books? Have you seen them before? So if you were watching one of the late shows, something and they're having a guest on, and like, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's going to talk about the Webb telescope, then we would think, yeah, I've heard of him. I know he's an astrophysicist. So what he's going to say is probably going to be correct. Derived is as judged by the audience throughout the speech. And again, as we said earlier, that might go up and down. Okay, that's our words that we're using and our actions. Are we smoothly transitioning? Are we using gestures? Are we pacing around and seeming nervous? So that would be like a negative kind of thing. Are we doing breakers like constantly pushing our hair back? So things to think about. We'll talk about that more with delivery. A good example of this is the Kennedy versus Nixon debate, and it kind of relates to earlier this idea that It's a perception issue. People who watched the first televised debate, which was John F. Kennedy versus Richard M. Nixon for president, when they watched the debate, people overwhelmingly said Kennedy won. People who listened to it on the radio overwhelmingly said Nixon won. Why? On television, Nixon refused to have any makeup put on, and so he looked like he had a 5 o'clock shadow. He looked almost kind of like a thug. He had sweat breaking out. It made him look nervous and menacing and unreliable. And so people who watched the debate, that visual, what they saw with Kennedy, overrode what Nixon was saying, and Nixon's perceived negative appearance in the way he looked overrode the actual credibility of the things he was saying. And then terminal again this is our credibility at the end of the speech. Hopefully at the end you've done everything well and cited everything, and people will say, hey, they did a good job and I got something out of that. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll do the last part so I don't have two big, huge videos for you.